All right, so good afternoon again, everyone. My name is Candace Maxwell. I serve as the Associate Vice President of Diversity, Equity, Belonging, and Inclusion at McHenry County College, but more specific to the Illinois Community College Diversity Commission. I do serve as the Vice President and President-elect, so it is wonderful to see you all today. Thank you all for joining us for this particular session, this PD session on creating space for dialogue, the Critical Conversation podcast. I am happy to have with us today Dr. Rick Daniels, who is the Director of Institutional Equity and Inclusion at Oakton College. I was really interested in hearing more about his podcast and thought that this would be a great opportunity to talk about how we get the message out and the different ways in which we might get the message out about the importance of diversity, equity, belonging, and inclusion. So welcome, Dr. Daniels.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Great to be here and great to always be in this space. So good to see you all, and thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. So let's just kind of get started. How did you find your pathway into diversity, equity, and inclusion work? And tell us a little bit about the podcast.
Sure. So again, thanks for having me today. I know that we've been in these spaces before. And so before I get started, I do want to send some positive energy and notes of solidarity as our work is under attack in a way that is critical to our survival, for us to be for us to stand together, but also to have some level of care for each other. And so I hope you know that I see the work that we all do, and I appreciate the work that we all do. And in our different situations, I'm standing in solidarity with you. Excuse me. I think I did DEI work before I knew what it was. Yeah. I think that I've always done it. I've always had a mindset for it. And I always, in some senses, feel like I was called to do it. You know, my parents are retired pastors from Milwaukee, and I grew up in a few states, but the majority of my childhood was spent in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and my parents were very involved in the community, and so I grew up watching them, you know, essentially give their lives to the community in one way or another, and I saw the benefits of that and the perils in some ways as well, the pain that you deal with as a servant leader and as someone who, as an occupation, you know, serves the community. And so for me, it really taught, it taught me something. I think it instilled something in me. And when I went to college, I think I went with the intent of making a difference, but I didn't really know exactly how I would do that yet. And so during my college experience, I got very involved with, you know, our Black Student Union, our student government. I was one of those students who had more clubs than classes, and had to make some pivots and shifts and pivots along the way so that I could actually graduate on time. But there was always a heart to help the community. There was always a heart to be involved in something that was happening that could create an impact. And so that led me into a career in higher education. And I started off, I realized that in every job that I've had in higher ed, I've had some level of a DEI plus focus, but didn't know it at the time. So for example, I started off as the advisor for Greeks at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and I managed the Greek letter organizations. However, it occurred to me maybe about 3 weeks into the job that I wasn't brought in to handle all of the Greeks. I was brought in to handle the National Panhandling Council, the NPHC, the Black Greeks. Yeah. It became clear that they brought me in to do some specific work with groups that, and I'll just be real, we didn't really listen to the advisors when we were on the yard. And so at first, I think that bothered me, but then I saw it as a unique opportunity to create a space for Black Greeks that hadn't existed at Whitewater before. We were always supported organizationally, but we didn't always have staff within, you know, the student affairs, student life area that really knew our culture enough to support us at the systemic level. And so that resulted in us expanding our council, growing it. We started the Multicultural Greek Council. We started a whole new Greek standards. And during that time period, I wrote a book on the history of stepping called Tap Dancing Without Shoes, The History of Stepping and the Impact on Greek Life and Popular Culture. And I used a lot of our practices at Whitewater to talk about, the ways in which stepping was being colonized at the time and how I thought, we could try to protect the art form. And so from Whitewater, I went and served as manager of student life and later dean of students at Rock Valley College, and then eventually director of student life and campus inclusion at Oakton, and later director of institutional equity and inclusion. And so I think that throughout my career, there's a common thread of servant leadership, and that combined with my passions and my identity landed me in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so by the time I figured out that I was a DEI professional, it occurred to me that I've been doing that through my whole career. So I'm sure that some of you can relate to different moments and milestones in your life where you realize, looking back, that you were always involved in the work of equity. And that's because equity work is a way of life. DEI is a way of life. And so I think that as we see it as a profession, as a profession, it might be relatively new, but as a way of life, it's as old as time. So I'm happy to be a part of it. The podcast started about a year and a half ago when I was promoted to this position with sits in human resources. And so I was in a student-facing position before, but now in a primarily employee-facing position. I was asked by our president, Dr. Julianne Smith, to come up with a way that we could have a continued dialogue with the campus about what was happening with equity work, not just at Oakland, but the surrounding events in society and how that impacted our work. And so I did not want to do another newsletter. I just couldn't see it, and so I sat and thought for a minute and I asked, well, what about the podcast space? And I have to admit that it wasn't something that was, it was still new at Oakton, but there was a podcast that existed, the AAPI podcast, which is hosted by dear Anna Titra Cole, who serves as our Compass. She's over the Compass program, Compass Grant. And she had a podcast, and I remember like listening to it, thinking, "Wow, that's really cool." I wonder how that works. And so when the idea came up to do a podcast about equity work, I thought that it would be an interesting thing to help tell the Oakton story while also covering what's happening in the larger society. So I reached out to a professor named Eric Rohn, who I knew from media services, and it turned out that we had a full podcast studio here on campus already, because they teach a class with it, but nobody really used it as much. And so we just kind of went in and got started. I admittedly did some trial and error. I have a few favorite podcasts of my own because my commute is pretty long. And so I'm really into music. I'm a musician. I love jazz. I love hip hop. I love all types of music. And so I wanted that to serve as a backdrop. But it took a while for us to really find a format that worked, that helped to do both of those things, talk about what's happening outside while also telling the Oakland story. And so I think in the early days, it was more of let's kind of see what happens. But then about 4 or 5 episodes in, it became clear that we needed a standard format. And so the overall goal is to just try to keep people aware, keep them informed, but also to keep them interested in the work that's happening so they can see themselves in the work as well.
So you talked a little bit about just finding the right format, and I would imagine maybe you went through several different iterations of that. So how did you kind of find that formula? Like, what was the process in that, and how did you even go about identifying guests? Is your audience mostly Oakton folks, or I listen to it, so obviously it's not just Oakton folks. So, but how do you actually go about that process? How did you find that format or that right fit for the podcast?
Thank you for listening. I think
it's good stuff. It's good stuff.
Thank you. We're very proud of it. I think in the beginning I was trying to be like all of the podcasts that I had heard before.
Okay.
So I liked Jalen and Jacoby. I like Code Switch, which is a podcast from NPR. PBS NewsHour has, which is my favorite, which is the news station that primary news station that I watch. they had theirs in sections. And so instead of doing the full news hour, they would section them out. And so I just went in and tried all of that. And I remember on the first episode, we found some really good music. I scoured the internet to find duty-free music, put the music under it. And then the feedback was that the music was whack. It was too loud. It wasn't good. And I remember taking so much time to try to figure out, the right music. So I started doing different music every episode, different instrumentals. I used our ASCAP membership to our advantage, and, found songs that I felt like were connected to the theme and the topic, that were relatable, but we're also soulful and dope and cool, and something that if you're on an hour-long road trip and you're going to listen to this, it's not just a bunch of voices. You also have something to kind of carry you through it. And so I think that became a really big part of the podcast. Once we were able to kind of get that settled in terms of what that felt like as a backdrop, I struggled at first to figure out topics. Because at first it was kind of just topics that I was coming up with, right? So here's 5 ways to be more inclusive, or, here's what's happening around Oakton that you should know. And then these kind of, became just really mundane. So I then shifted to really heavy topics, and tried to capture some of the things that were happening in the world at the time. And at the same time, we were doing in studio and live podcasts. So we did it in studio, but then we also set up and did it live as well. And that was a lot on everybody involved. As far as the discussion format, it was more of an interview format at first. And that really bothered me because I didn't know how to get out of it. And so you would have people, you would ask a question and they would say, well, what do you think? Or what do you think? And then they would just move to the next person down the line. And I'm thinking in my mind, the show is called Critical Conversations. We have to have a conversation. So I started to write less specific questions and come up with more of a topical agenda. And then I asked people, I would brief them and tell them before the show that our goal is to have a discussion, to have a conversation. I remember one time in particular, we did an episode and the episode was pretty dry. It was good, but I felt like it was dry as the conversation went along. As soon as the conversation was over, as soon as the recording stopped, we sat and talked for maybe another 30 or 40 minutes about the subject. And that was the conversation we should have recorded.
Yeah.
And so about 30 or 40 minutes into it, I'm like, man, why didn't we turn the mic on? And so that led to a habit of us keeping the mics hot through the session. And so a lot of times we'll do outtakes, so we'll keep the mics going. And some of what you hear in the final mix is actually an outtake that was so good in the discussion that took place afterwards. We had to work it in. And so now the current format, I think, is really good because it gives us an opportunity to have a more topical discussion, a topical agenda with some great music, but also the ability to capture more authentic dialogue rather than just an interview like we did before.
Okay. So how many people are involved with just kind of the logistics and the background, getting it all organized and produced and all of that? I'm assuming this is not a one-person show, so.
No, not at all. It has turned into quite a bit of a production.
Okay.
So first of all, I want to shout out Jaletta Patrick, who was the Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs and Dean of Access, Equity, and Diversity. She coined the original term critical conversations in a series that she used to do here. And so I asked when she left if I could take that on, and it became the subject of the podcast. So shout out Jaletta for having, birthing the early parts of this vision. There are essentially 3 people who work on the show. Myself, as I guess you could say I'm the executive producer. I never put it in those terms, but someone that kind of oversees all aspects. Brenda Cruz, who's the coordinator. So she helps coordinate all guests, all logistics. She books the studio time and helps to pull everything together. And then our producer is Eric Rome, who is our professor of, I think it's media services, or professor of media. And he's the engineer, so he's there to record, but then he does the edits as well. Okay. We use primarily Logic Pro, but we've also used GarageBand at one point or another. But if you are looking to start one out and you have the equipment for it, either Logic or Audacity could work. But he's a great editor. And we have about 5 mics that we're able to use at one time. So I have to also be mindful when I'm booking guests, not to invite the Wu-Tang Clan, but just to, have a few people that we can have a good conversation around, which sometimes leads to, maybe a part one or a part two. But it is an operation. I think it's growing over time. I think we're doing more as we go along, but ultimately it's myself, Brenda Cruz, and Eric Rome who helps to put it together.
Okay. How how much time are you spending on the podcast? Just, start to finish, booking the guest, all of the recording, like what does that look like in terms of like your week?
That's a good question, because at one point I was wondering if I was spending too much time on it or if I was giving the impression that this was all I was doing with my job. And so I was mindful about how much I posted, how much I talked about it. I think that we are actually finally getting into a groove where I'm in the studio about once a week, either on Tuesday or on Thursday, depending on what's happening. But we really wanted to get more content out there this year. So we started doing shorts and having, like, for example, we're going to do an episode for all of the holidays and observances. So if you go onto the site now, you'll see January holidays and observances, February, and so on. And it's just a 5-minute episode where actually feature Brenda Cruz as our coordinator, who reads about the holidays and observances and then talks about ways that we can support students during that time. So typically it takes about I would say maybe 3 to 4 hours per week, depending on what's happening. We typically record all of our episodes within a half hour to 45 minutes. So we schedule time for a quick sound check. We go into it, and then within 45 minutes, we're done. But the pre-production, as it relates to getting the guests, selecting the music, which at this point is really easy, as it relates to just grabbing the link and taking it from there. But then the editing takes a long time, and I'm not involved as much in the editing process. Eric does that, and it usually takes about an hour or two per episode, depending on how that. This year, I am working with the budget office to try to get him some LHEs stipend because his editing work is expert, but it takes a while, and we all went into this voluntary, and I want to make sure that he's that we're equitably compensating him for his time.
Right.
But I would say about 3 to 4 hours of time per week.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about just the some of the topics and how you choose your topics, and certainly given, our current state of affairs, how have you been able to utilize the podcast to address some of these trending issues?
That's I'll probably start from where I am now and then trace my way back. It's really easy to pick topics at this point in time.
Yeah.
In the worst way, right? But again, the goal was to tell Oakton stories. What I didn't want to do, I wanted this to be Oakton's podcast, not Rick Daniels' podcast, which, contrary to popular belief, is why I protested having my face on the cover, because I didn't want to necessarily be so tied to it that if something changed or I made a transition, the podcast would, ultimately go with it. I wanted it to be seen as an Oakton story. However, I was convinced by Eric and Brenda that it would be good to have an identifier, and so that people could have a face to put to the podcast, which I ultimately think helped to grow it. But I still wanted to stand alone as its own brand. So with that being said, I had to realize that these are not just the topics I want to talk about, but the topics that need to be heard by the people. And so I had to check myself early on, especially after season 1. Looking back on it, it was like most of that was just stuff that I wanted to say, or stuff that I thought was important at the time. This season, we wanted to be more intentional. And so we started to ask questions that help us to lead to podcast topics. So, for example, one of our recent episodes is entitled Beyond the Rainbow. And it helps to ask the question, are we really doing enough to centralize the needs and concerns of our LGBTQ plus family here at Oakton? And are we centralizing that community in a positive way? And so we did the first part of 2 episodes where we interview a crew of faculty, staff, and administrators. And the part 2, which will come out in June, will interview students. And so that just came from a genuine question in our strategic planning process for the next year. So all of my goals are connected to the president's goals. And one of them was to release a certain amount of episodes for the year. And as uh, in our goal to keep people informed and engaged, we actually put this into the president's strategic plan as a way to keep people engaged. So it's officially like not just a pet project anymore. It's actually a part of the college landscape. And so that meant that we had to centralize topics that were connected to the strategic plan. So we actually have a podcast episode on the strategic plan itself, the different pillars of it. And then out of that, we used it to help us to branch topics that were connected as well. We also had, we intentionally met with marketing and communications, as well as some of the other areas of the college to put together the college's editorial calendar. And we worked in the episodes in connection to what was happening on campus at the time. So for example, we have our Learning Day, which is our big professional development day, and we did an episode on the topic of Learning Day. However, there are things that happen that shape and shift our attention, and then we have to pivot. So the executive orders that were signed recently, we did a campus briefing session on that, sort of like a press conference, but more like a campus discussion. And we asked a professor of political science to do a small mini lecture on what an executive order is, the history of it, and then profile the ones that are unique to us. So we then invited him, Professor Keith Simons is his name, on the show the next day, basically to do a version of that on the show. So the executive orders episode is up now if anybody wants to take a listen to it, and that profiles essentially what we did before. So we plan out the episodes, but we plan it so that there's room for us to pivot if we need to. And I think that's what I've learned, is not to get stuck in the scheduling process. I think I was trying to keep it on a schedule, the first season, but now it's like, no, you know what? Can we get in the studio on Thursday to talk about something can happen between now and Thursday that could shift the entire, format. Right. I mentioned PBS NewsHour a minute ago. They just let go their entire DEI staff. Mm-hmm. It's the public broadcasting network. Like, that has to get brought up. We have to make space for those things. And so I think that's been the fun part, is to be fluid. But we do try to keep a schedule, and that schedule is connected to our strategic plan and to the questions that we know we really need to be asking on campus.
Okay. So I'm curious. So the one episode that I most recently listened to was the one on code switching. And I'm kind of getting caught up. So I was on that episode, and it's kind of one of my favorite topics to even talk about. And you mentioned a couple of things in that episode. You talked about guiding the narrative, which I thought was a great way to just speak about, we're not necessarily trying to, create all these narratives, but we're guiding the narratives, we're guiding people. But then you also talked about this idea of those of us who are in this space, but feel like we are having to defend DEI in the space. Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of that episode and how that kind of fits into this idea of code switching? I know it's a little bit not necessarily what we plan to talk about, but I thought it was such an interesting episode as we, kind of deal with how we are almost put in a defense mode right now to support our work.
So no, I'm grateful you asked that question, because right now I feel like I have DEI across my forehead. You know what I'm saying? And personally, I relish in that. I think that it's I've always knew that this work needed a champion, that this kind of work needs someone who's able to defend it, who's able to talk about its importance, who's able to articulate its effectiveness. And I've always tried to at least do that in my role. Right now, there's pressure to do it because lives and livelihoods, are being impacted to such a great degree. So as it relates to code switching, I go back and forth with it, because I think that there's a lot to be said about the trauma that's associated with that. The question of, as you mentioned, we talked about guiding the narrative versus controlling the narrative. And my philosophy is that I can't control the narrative because I can't control what you think. but I can guide the narrative with my works. I can guide the narrative with my deeds and with the words that I say. And so you can develop whatever or take whatever you want to from that. But I have to guide it in a way where our work creates the narrative around what we do. And that really came from the establishment of this office. It was a new office. And there were a lot of questions around it, a lot of questions around how the resources were developed, used to develop the office. And so that's when we said, okay, well, we can't control what anybody thinks, but we can control what we do. And what we do can help to guide it. And so I think that from a code switching perspective, that can be applied individually as well. And I think that my point in that episode was to try to send the message that we need to be in a space where we can bring that's welcoming of our best self, our authentic self, and our whole self if we choose to bring our whole self. And I asked the question, what is the difference between bringing your whole self and bringing your authentic self to work? And there was a great discussion around it. And I personally said that I think that I bring my authentic self to work every day. But it is up to me whether or not I'm bringing my whole self to work every day. And that is, there are certain parts of me that deserve to be, that I deserve to reserve if I choose to. So I don't have to bring everything I'm going through to work. I don't have to bring every attitude that I have to work. And I don't have to tell you everything about my life either. But what I do value is being in a space where I can be who I am and be who I am unapologetically. And so that led to a really great discussion on code switching, where there were, a range of a variety of opinions on the impact of it, which then helped us to understand how, in a way, we in some ways as DEI practitioners, we might do that with the offices that we have, and not just the individuals, but like we may code switch the operation. We may, decide to pivot if we need to. We may have to understand that there are certain parts of our office that are for the people to see, and there are certain parts of our office that are for the staff to manage and to maintain. So it was just a really interesting discussion that, frankly, I don't know if we even got to a conclusion on, which was kind of special. We never really landed. And I thought that's what made the discussion healthy. There was no conclusion, no one to say, well, code switching is right or wrong, or you should or shouldn't do it, or we should move past it or not. There are some people who are in spaces where that is how they survive. That's how they survive. There are others who are in spaces that may be a little bit more free. So I think that we learned in that discussion to respect the reality of that from people who have to do it versus people who choose to do it. So I'm sorry, I feel like that answer kind of went a number of different places, but
that's a great answer. It's even making me think about just the value that's placed on the work that we do sometimes is based on our ability to code switch in some instances. Like, are you listening to me because of my ability or the ways in which I've been able to code switch? Is it valid or valued because of how it's being presented to you? So I think there's a lot there to be unpacked, which is why those critical conversations are important. Pun intended.
sorry if I can just say one more thing to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that what's happening at the federal level with DEI work may be interpreted as a code switch, because I think that in some ways the language is being challenged. And as practitioners, my question is, how are we going to help evolve and grow this profession and this practice and this mindset? And I think that in some ways, we have to learn how to do our work better. I was talking to a good friend of mine, and I'm like, as practitioners, we got to stop engaging in shutdown culture when we do a session and somebody says something we disagree with. Yeah. We should be actively watching, news outlets and stations and people that we disagree with to hear and be comfortable and sit in those opinions that we disagree with. People laugh at me a lot. My wife doesn't know how I do it, but I watch Fox News every day, every single day. On a daily basis, I watch it, and people think I'm crazy. I actually kind of think I am too, if I'm being honest. But the reason I watch it is because I feel like I need to be comfortable hearing opinions that I know I'm probably never going to agree with. I need to be emotionally stable if I ever run into somebody who operates and speaks in that way. And then number three, I need to be able to practice engaging across differences in a way that's productive. So in other words, if Fox News calls me, I'm going. I'm going on there. And I'm going right at Tucker Carlson. I want to go right at Laura Ingraham. I want to go right at Gutfield, right? I want to be a part of these discussions that are hard and difficult so that when you start to get riled up and make statements, you're not just going to get me emotional and shut me down. So a part of it is more like a mental exercise. So all of that to say, I think that we're in a space now where we are having to learn how to shift some of the language we use around the work, our approach to the work, in a way that's productive, in a way that's protective, but in a way that still keeps our integrity around it. And some people don't have a choice to do it, some do. But right now, and ultimately, in some way, the practice of DEI itself is going through a code switch exercise that I think is going to really impact the next 5 to 10 years of this practice.
That's a really interesting way to look at the evolution of the work, for sure, or how we even approach the work. So I'm curious, do you have a favorite episode so far, or one that has resonated with your audience that you've gotten a lot of feedback for or on?
I actually think the code switching one, that's not my favorite one, but that's the one we get the most feedback on.
Okay.
That's the one we get the most feedback on. I think it was the one that people could relate to the most. I think my favorite one might be the one that we just did on Beyond the Rainbow, because I got the chance to sit as an ally in that room, and hear and learn as well. I'll just be honest and say that we were not able to identify any Black out staff members to be a part of the group. And I felt terrible about that. I really did. I went back and forth about that because I thought it was a diverse group, but I felt like we weren't able to really reach our voices. And so that caused me to ask myself, like, okay, how tapped into the community are you really? Do people trust you enough to embrace you in that way? But just to sit as an ally, to be a part of a conversation that I thought was very well, everybody participated in a way that I thought was authentic. That might be my favorite, just because of how well it went. But I think the most impactful one so far has been the code switching exercise, which I think has been pretty cool.
So has it been what you've expected so far? Are there things that you would change moving forward? What do you kind of see for the future of the Critical Conversation podcast?
Is it everything I expected? Yeah, I don't know. I don't really know what I expected. I just jumped in.
Okay.
And said, okay, let's just see how this turns out. So I guess in a way that it has been, because it's been a really great experience. I think what's next, I'm in the process of writing a grant for a larger studio. I would love for us to have some dedicated studio space where we can do both video and audio. And I would like to see it grow to include outside guests next season. For the first 2 seasons we've done, yes, Roy, I see you in the chat. For the first 2 seasons we've done mostly open guests. But I would love to have some of you on the show to talk about your experiences, to talk about how and where you experience how the work that you do is impacted. But we have to figure out a medium for that, right? Because we're all in different spaces. So that means that we might have to shift to a Zoom podcast format at some point, and just create a more wider range of offerings. But I really do love it. I really do love to get the notification on my own phone that, there's a podcast there. I love when people listen to it. Our numbers are doing very well. We have been keeping up with listeners. And so I think that it has been a really meaningful experience for me in terms of just being able to provide a space for dialogue and connection and sharing with others.
I do want to open it up for questions here in a minute, but the last thing that I want to ask is just a message that you'd like to leave us with on creating this dialogue. Any suggestions, recommendations that you might have for someone who wants to create a podcast on their campus or something similar?
Yeah, Thanks for that. So I am probably still on fire from Kendrick's Super Bowl performance.
Okay.
And the different forms of symbolism that are going to take really years to unpack. And as a Kendrick fan, really since the very, very early days, if you've ever listened to one of his albums, you'll understand that it's always heavy laden and packed with, different symbolism and multiple meanings and words that maybe don't, pop out to you until later. You go back and you learn something new. That's the best kind of music for me. Is music I can continue to learn from. I can listen to a Coltrane record from '64 that I've heard a million times and then hear him or Elvin Jones or Jimmy Garrison or McCoy Tyner do something different. And it's like, how did I listen to this album from 50 years ago so many times and I'm just now hearing this riff or I'm just now hearing this note. So that's the beauty of it. I would suggest that we think of how we dialogue around DEI in that same way. How can we create space for multiple meaning, multiple ways of interpretation, multiple narratives, a diverse set of offerings and topics that allow us to engage, even in areas that we're not an expert in. First season, I chose topics that I knew a lot about. This season, I chose topics that I, wasn't the expert in. So I could also be the student as well. And I can have authentic reactions on the microphone, and not this sort of like, hello, everyone, welcome, this cookie cutter sort of podcast thing. For me, it was about creating that balance. And so if you're creating a space for dialogue, whether it's in person, whether it's audio, whether it's video, whether it's a newsletter, how can you put your creative passion, put some creativity around your passion to create something that can resonate with people on a deeper level? That's what I feel like that performance did for me. And we might not ever see that again. We should be clear, we might not see that again because it doesn't fit the typical Super Bowl format, right? In a lot of different ways. And so just finding ways to have multiple meaning that resonate with people on a deeper level, I think is what I would recommend for any medium that you choose as a dialogue.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insight and input about the podcast and ways in which we can think about creating some type of podcast or something similar in our own campuses so that we can continue to have some really great conversation. I do want to take some time now to open things up for any questions or comments that anyone may have. So now is the time to do that. Feel free to unmute yourself, or if you are unable to do that, feel free to add any questions into the chat.
And let me say thank you for having me as well. This is very, very humbling to be asked. I was very shocked and surprised and grateful to talk a little bit about it and tell the story of it. I've actually never told the story of it before, other than just like the general, here's how it came about. So excuse me if my answers may have been long-winded. I'm really just kind of putting some of this together as I go. So I think you've inspired me to maybe chart out the story a little bit better. But thanks for having me. I really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. Any questions or comments?
Hey, Dr. Daniels, Keith Barnes from Rock Valley College. Hey,
Dr.
congratulations on your work. The question I have is, how long typically does your podcast last? I didn't catch parts of that. We do them at RBC, and we kind of keep them short and tailored to one topic. So I just wanted to know typically how long does your podcast last? The episode.
I don't know y'all have one. I definitely want to listen. So please let me know where I can find that. We go typically podcasts last between 30 and 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Sometimes we do the shorter episodes like the holidays and observances, which go, maybe 5 minutes. But typically 30 to 45 minutes is our runtime.
Yeah, ours, they don't, let's just say our marketing department is quite territorial. They don't like for us to release them to the public, so it's internal, but I'll sneak one, somehow one will go in your email inbox, but y'all didn't hear that.
Well, now we are recording, so.
It's all
Oops.
good. It's all good.
Other questions, comments, anyone?
Oh, Roy, look at that dimple in that tie, man. Woo, that is perfect.
Do a podcast that shows people how to do this. I'm sorry. Man, I really enjoyed everything that you said today and inspired by it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I truly appreciate that. Truly appreciate that. One thing to mention from an operations standpoint, we are on Apple Music, Spotify, the Apple website, and Libsyn. And so if you are getting your podcast fired up and you need information on how to get registered with those, feel free to send me an email and I'll be happy to help walk you through that. You know, one thing I will say is that when we announce the podcast to the public and we say we're available on all major platforms, typically that's when it clicks for people that are like, oh, this is real. Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, sure. I'll check it out. So it does help as a marketing piece. And then also when we have to give some of our guests a speech when they come into the studio, because they don't expect it to be a real studio. They think it's like a phone or something. And so they'll walk in and they're like, oh, there's mics in here, or there's headphones. So, you know, just kind of walking people through that. But if you need help with the infrastructure, feel free to reach out and we'll help you to get set up.
There's definitely something about seeing the equipment that makes it real. Like, oh.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Well, we will be sure to add all of the information in the show notes as well for folks to find the podcast. I would absolutely encourage everyone to tap into the Critical Conversations podcast. It really is a great podcast. I love podcasts. This is one that I listen to regularly, and I have many, and this is one I do listen to regularly. So, and I'm trying to convince some folks that we need to do more of this to get that word out, to get that message out. And because it feels very conversational, it's so easy to listen to and pick up on so many different really good nuggets and good ideas. So thank you for offering that, not just to the Oakland community, but to the larger community as well.
Thank you.
So with that, thank you all for joining us today. I will give you back the gift of a little bit of time. This will be available probably next week. And again, we'll have all of the information for the podcast in the show notes. So thank you all for joining us today and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.